Thank you to Chobi Mela and the organizers for the invitation here today. We have a nice, intimate group, and so I will, this might be an expanded talk. I'm going to take a little time with it, so just sit back and relax, and let's flow into it. A lot of what I'm going to discuss today has been based on also what I've been observing of the festival and the kinds of talks that have existed. So in a way, it's about modes of production for me. What has been produced, what are some of the concerns that have been cropping up over the last couple of years, and whether they are sort of in one way or another, thank you, one way or another connected, whether they're disparate, whether they provoke thoughts about ways in which we're looking at the world in humanist ways, or whether we consider questions of transnationality to be significant now and why. These are questions that I've been thinking about, but I'll quickly begin as I have a lot to read. In a great relief of the heart, when the thing was done, that had set my soul aghast, and nothing was left of the picture unsheathed from the past, but the ashen ghost of a card that it figured on. So I've used this poem by Thomas Hardy from the late 19th century in one of the recent exhibitions that I've put together called Between Word and Image, Ellipsis, that is on in the city of Jaipur all the way till May. And the concerns there were about how the word itself has become an image today, and how images are a particular language, and how do we sort of unpack them from time to time. So what remains of images? How do they embody an encrypted narrative, elided biographies, which present but a fraction of what was actually produced? As you may know, I'm working extensively with the 19th century archive, and what remains of the 19th century archive, all of it, is still less than what is produced in a single day today. And I think that's an interesting sort of equation to think about. I would like then to also think about or theorize what are the known territories of image making which lead into the tenuous zone in which images circulate or operate. What are the personal nodes? What are the institutional nodes by which we would attempt this scaffolding of a memory, the scaffolding of time that the picture so beautifully inhabits, born of an individual, but which may reference a very broad paradigm and prefigure our affiliation to location and space. Perhaps we no longer need affiliations anymore. Maybe we do not need affiliations to history or the contemporary, but what we must understand is their contemporaneity. When I look at images like these, for instance, those who survived the pitfalls of history, and here I'm showing you a 19th century photo of Bahadur Shah Zafar, the blind and enfeebled king of India, and of course his descendants who are now rickshaw pullers in Old Delhi. They are also locked, very strangely, to place and temporality. Families and what remains of them become kaleidoscoped in a kind of social irony. Such attempts to photograph or remain in the photograph can be dangerous because we do not know what purpose they eventually served, and Bahadur Shah Zafar was of course put on display for a European community to come and observe him while he was capitulating and capitulated. And so in many respects, my engagement with material remains, past and present, are devised to foreground how evidence about the montaging of personal lives is inscribed constantly into shifting geographies and to shifting surfaces. But it's also important to think about the data retrieval of a century, and this will lead to a gradual and unprecedented unpacking. Photography has and can, in and outside the subcontinent, capture the illusory, birthing a form of expression that is open and that is viral, but it is a potent refractor. But there are unnoticed and newer imbalances in the way emerging canons are construed. The digital canon and its universalism are undeniable in their ubiquity, but they are also uncertain in their image and their message. One of the recent publications we have done is also this one, and I bring this to light because they're sort of outside the necessary periphery of our knowledge, and I was really taken by Shahidul's talk on Mufassal photographers, because in a way this publication is also about that. It's called Photo Peshawar, and it's looking at families that migrated from India to Afghanistan, and when the Taliban took over, in order to save their photographs, they moved to a place called Peshawar. And so we've devoted an entire publication to this, which also includes, the sort of popular culture interface with photography. So historically, the subcontinent, in some respect, has been perceived from the outside in. But would that induce us to reconsider the nature of image making itself? And so what we see of the world today can be an airbrush of history, a new hologram of the self that seeks to transgress boundaries by inserting itself as a virtual presence, a media tactic that is used. And I sort of wanted to show this gentleman very, very small and in the corner over there, because he won the election by using this particular kind of a strategy. But hopefully he will slide out of this image very, very soon. The image then is a kind of strategy. It exposes social movements that have reached a particular kind of crescendo and then sometimes entirely dissipated. How do we then configure space in an image, which I read here as geography and nation, and time, that I read as history and the nation? Is there a desperate and now new iconography of resistances through the image? And is the role of the archive essentially to foreground this resistance? How do we question impunity, statehood? How do we ask whether there are creative strategies, aesthetic productions, and collective methods of countering the present? How different circuits of circulation may catalyze our imagination of the image? And over here with the archive, we've done a few things. Our next issue, as I've shown to some of you already, is the citizen issue, and we work with a broad group of individuals comprising the photo editorial, comprising sort of associate editors and so on. But we will launch this, and what I was trying to do is slowly unearth new material that brings together the idea of resistance, and from South Asia more generally. So it's been a gradual process. It actually doesn't exist. I'm extremely inspired by the work of Nayantara and the work that they have done with the Dalit and the Feminist Archive to a great extent. But we found also this material which belongs to the Communist Party cultural wing in India, which is called Janam, and they used to do street performances. And effectively those became modes of resistance and activation and activity as well. This sort of goes on to also generate what the archive really means today, whether records, as it says over here, can be tools of oppression. It has gone to artist productions such as Sheba Chachi's work, and I've just about finished an article for her on the Tate, at the Tate, and she looks basically at feminist movements from India, but then those are kind of melded into how the image is actually not stationary at any point of time, and so those evidences that you find from the 1980s and 1990s can be used today quite productively. It also generated work for another exhibition that was done in Goa recently in December, which was called Ephemeral New Futures for Passing Images, and this is the work of Uzma Mohsen, who was here, but it was a commissioned work in a sense where she goes and she files a right to information against the government or to the government in order to bring about documents that they have to file, that people have to file in order to petition a moment of resistance in a public space. And so the images sort of became montages of their documents and the portraits of the people. Quite fascinating. The archive we have also sort of triggered as performance pieces. This is a work based on the 19th century photograph by Felice Viato, and I consider this to be one of the first staged images ever to be produced. A little history there is that Felice Viato, who's an Italian-British individual, goes to the site of Lucknow, to the site of mutiny and retribution. He cannot find the bones of the mutineers, so he goes to a local graveyard and pulls the bones out, and he places them in front of this monument and then takes the photograph. So performance piece was generated around this. And the last one, which pertains also to Bangladesh, is a work that we have initiated from the archive, which looks at the disappearance of a king who then reappears many years later, and the photograph serves as evidence to prove his identity over a 12-year trial And of course, this is a place called Bhaval, which is also in Bangladesh, and I believe the Court of Ward still owns the property, and this is a court case from 1910. So just some of the ways in which we have thought about how to trigger and what to trigger in the archive is significant. I guess to an extent, one of the other things we did while working on this iconography of resistance is invite this photographer. Her name is Laura L. Tantoway, and she produced this stunning book on Tahrir Square, which we then remounted in New Delhi 2 years ago. So what is the trajectory of our workings around the archive? It's something that we're thinking about at all times, and this is something we can maybe discuss shortly after. So the role played by images from the region, as I have seen them, are not only about where its people go, but also about what survives from this place. And so enter new narratives, a region that today is bound to an uncertain identity yet again, suggesting that actual migrations, not only images of them, can enable community and memory projects. And as they drift and cruise, we find that there are various cultural imperatives that arise from these narratives. The question, therefore, may not be about liberating regional photography or local photography from the so-called Western gaze, but rather devising trajectories of cultural exploration from any more of straitjacketing. The question, therefore, may also be about how all gazes have elapsed to a certain extent, and they have done this with irony and with discomfort. And perhaps we no longer need gaze alone, but policy. Can images serve to inform a certain cultural policy over time? And again, Naeem's talk yesterday for me was very intriguing because the non-aligned movement in India actually triggered a lot of cultural activity. The Council for Cultural Relations in India from the mid-70s and 80s onwards started doing various performances and conferences on the idea of the image and how it interfaces with theatre. And we actually have some documents where theatre performance and their interface with new media was actually a conference that was done in India in 1979. So I really think about that when we're thinking about the archive. So diasporic communities and waves of convergence have always been the subject of the lens since its very beginning, starting from, let's say, documents like the Oriental Races and Tribes. The proposition then is about how photography inevitably manages a kind of exchange, a kind of participation. And we jettison from this, from 1863, to a newer archive that we've started looking at, and that is the material from the 1960s and 70s. I find this quite significant also in the context of those Mufassil photographers Shahidul was talking about. And it kind of also interfaces with the coming of the hippie generation into India. And images like these I find fascinating because absolutely no one looks stoned in them. The archive then plays the role of a recontextualizer as communities are made as much as they are identified. But there does come a time when the private and public lose sight of each other's domains, when the personal life of a photograph, a photographer, or even a compiler becomes so celebrated and so confounded as an architect of the present that he or she may lay claim to the past and reveal this mosaic that goes well beyond the surface image. And as I mentioned to you, this is the exhibition that was done in Goa this year, Ephemeral New Futures for Passing Images, in which we tried to interact with the popular culture of photography in various respects. One aspect of this I will show you as a video piece at the end of this presentation. We also interacted with archives from the south of India. This is one called the Stars Archive, which looks at Tamil Nadu studio photography more generally. We sort of created this sort of interaction between South Asian repositories and whether they reveal something for and with each other. It also goes to the popular domain of photography, and Alicia yesterday was talking about the idea of Kashmir and its postcard circulation. We've just done an entire book on the history of South Asian postcards, starting of course with its residence in Calcutta through the artist Werner Rosler, who started that, the first postcard from Calcutta, which was eventually, of course, it started in Austria, but it comes to India quite soon after its invention. And so my question is about the canon, the archive, the contemporary, and where it sits as place, as subject, and as ideology. Perhaps the tender violence of and upon the image, to use a phrase by the author Martha Wexler, who looks at the domestic as a space that generates hidden norms and structures, can suggest that the terrains of the personal need pedagogical infusion, challenged not only through social experiments, but exhibitionary practice. Social motivations with the work of community that challenges norms, conjugality and the place of the individual in it, the place of confronting the self through that which is familiar. As Arundhati Roy, who will speak tomorrow, says very clearly in her first book, there was a trouble with families, and I read them as familiarity, because like invidious doctors, they knew exactly where it hurt. But once you know where it hurts, you can anticipate what is sensitive to you, and maybe you can reverse it, maybe you can prepare for it. And so here, early viewership is important to me as well. And so I'm juxtaposing Pahari paintings with the work of another photographer, Udayaram and Govindram from Jaipur in the 19th century. The historical image suggested that everyone who could strike a pose and thereby unsettle the status quo should do so, that everyone should be included in the citizenry of photography and the camera world, the quotidian round enlarging the circle, and that eventually the camera will invite us to draw ourselves from the domestic to the personal by negotiating what is being seen and ways of seeing them. The comparative miniature photographs attributed to Udayaram and Govindram over here for me play a kind of equalizing function to help shape visual discourses. And I wonder whether we can consider them on par with the work of another ruler, and I'm going to show you some of this work, called Ram Singh II, whose exhibition is also currently on in Jaipur. I find this relationship that Ram Singh, whose images I'm about to show you, quite fascinating. He was the first photographer, patron king of India, and his archive has been more or less hidden for several decades, obviously from the 19th century, because he's an avid photographer from the 1860s. But for the first time, a sort of large body of his work has been put before the public. But he also has another kind of an image practice and an archive which I find fascinating, which I will show you. For me, it goes also a little bit further in pressing what the archive should and can do, because he actually also engages in the sexual act and brings it to a tradition of courtly congress, which suggests patronage as a private diary of pleasure-giving norms. The personal is implied in this trans history when one of the great self-portraitists captures himself in the perennial act of lovemaking in a manner that is conversant with the Mughal court. And it is the shattering, this very image from the 1860s, I find the shattering of an overworked political cliche about the lives of rulers. So this is Ram Singh II, again unseen portraits of him from the mid-1850s going to the 1860s. He also is a copyist, so he documents paintings in his archive, still life, and we've got an entire section in the exhibition devoted to this. This is the show that is on currently in Jaipur, and dimensions of it. And the next photograph is the one I'm really talking about, this sort of relationship of courtly tradition with the contemporary. These are also fascinating because to an extent he's one of the first photographers to document women from the court, thereby making him a kind of unique figure alongside India's first known photographer, Ahmad Ali Khan. But anyway, with due warning, the next photograph is something that I managed to find as well. And that's Ram Singh II on the top, in Congress, as they say, and on the left-hand side at the bottom, 100 years before him, the Mughal miniature. And here the photographer's unmappable sense of place embraces the spectacle of being viewed. These practices may now be deemed subversive to an extent, but are about the social documentary passing through the tenuous ground of its interface with a certain aesthetic of private reportage. There was a time, as is now, in which much of photographic evidence was lost. This has remained outside our terms of reference for many, many years. They are displaced, they are orphaned, but they are also left behind, and often they are very seized. The time of recovery should therefore now begin. I want to now take this to another space and time, which has got to do with pre-independence and sort of histories of photography that have also remained outside the domain. How would then we view material that has also been restrained by the government? And I've tried to show this album over the last 3 years in New Delhi at national institutions, where it has been kind of met with some form of resistance. How would this unpublished album of the Congress Party in India allow us to enter the hallowed space of a national institution? Do all of these personal political testimonies actually now mark a significant counter-archive, which privileges family and community as the beacons of a certain activism? And all of this, for the most part, was done pre-independence. I was also fascinated with this. The British Empire in Colour by Art Malik showed these original clips from the time of partition and independence. And so with freedom came one of the largest migrations. We know this, 4 million in one direction, 6 million in another. And you have Lieutenant Colonel Boyd Hudson, who flies over this oceanic sway of movement and displacement. And the archive, I feel, then placed along such timelines reconfigures those who lived in time. The archive generously postulates beyond the claim of any one voice, and in doing so assumes the power and potential for reconstructing the past and the present, addressing perhaps photography's secular culture at a time when the country's identity is so confounded in questions of refugee, in questions of alien, and questions of other. The repetition and flow of images and of people who traveled with them, and today as government seize their belongings as they enter new homes and new countries, must bring the remnants that are also contained in collections, private and public, university and museum and gallery, to another anticipatory moment. How do institutions counter cultural displacement? Is it by evoking the universal language of photography, our reader friendliness with material, by telling us that for the contemporary, an alternative history can still matter? But our relationship to history has been severed. And to an extent, we tried to show this in another exhibition that is also up in Jaipur by a contemporary artist called Nandan Ghia, who says pertinently that attachments have failed. And this sort of usage of modern and pre-modern photographs in order to create the language of encounter is something that we found fascinating. And we use in several parts images from, or he has used rather, images from independence as well. And so to an extent there's a popular culture referencing over here. There's this use of the moving image and the still image coming to bear with one another in a very constructive way. I've also taken the liberty right now, because we are in the Goethe Institute, to show you another archive that was recently exhibited. I think this was a year and a half that I did in Goa as well, related to the lives of the Wershings. Joseph Wershing arrives in India to shoot the first Indo-European film, which is called The Light of Asia, in 1926. And he works for a studio called Emelka Studios in Germany. And he begins a partnership that eventually leads to the birthing of the first production house for cinema in India, which is the Bombay Talkies in 1936. But what remains primarily right now are his images that were shot on a Leica camera from the mid-1920s to the mid-1930s. Now juxtapose his work, which is the one on the left. We're looking at this pioneering actor, Devika Rani, and 100 years, well, let's say about 80 years or so before him, the work of Udairam and Govindram, and the relationship that you can draw to the two is fascinating. And I find that there is a sort of convivial moment to encounter here. These are just some views from the exhibition. But this brings us to the moment of independence. During the Second World War, as a German living in the erstwhile British colony, Joseph Wershing was placed in an internment camp for foreign nationals between 1939 and 1947. He was separated from his wife Charlotte at this point of time as well, and his son Peter Wolfgang, who was in another internment camp. An air bombing raid during the Second World War completely destroyed his family house in Germany, and so with the passage of time, he spends most of his afterlife, after the war, here. But what's interesting again about the Bombay Talkies are films like these. The first film that they produce is called Achut Kanya, or The Untouchable Maiden, in 1936, dealing with the social position of Dalit girls, and is considered a reformist period piece something that we grapple with even today. Dealing with rumor and mob violence, the oppressive morality of the state is constantly referred to as an engine which keeps growing. The projection of India to the outside world, now through a mainstream moving image, brings narrative and image to yet another surface reality that questions even today ideas of familiarity, dissonance, passivity, and distance. And these are the shifting fault lines which can evoke memories about the past for the future. And it's interesting that there are always corrective functions therein, and that's Joseph Worshing in Bombay setting up his gear. He was the cinematographer of the Bombay talkies, and he came with 3 other Germans. So for me, in this talk, which I have not yet begun, so I'm just about to begin my talk, is about how bracketed images from any one point in time express each other's impressions and limitations and mobilize each other's tendencies and freedoms. Can that be done? How do we do that without openly mirroring our own ethics? How do you become, therefore, an insider to the other? How do you affect the perception of the world through homegrown images alone? Or do you do so by occupying a space that is a new transient configuration of the image? And I was interested in this writing by Drik Singh, who's a young anthropologist working out of Berkeley, I think. And he talks about intensities as a very good way to work through images, or pran, or life forces, rather than identities. And perhaps we can, through pran, help measure the distances and the nearnesses to our origins, and do so in a less oppressive way. Where there is a focus on particular histories, where the viewed subject as well as viewer subjectivity can meet, and where new light is thrown on institutional endorsements of the image. And to an extent, what I'm trying to focus on for the rest of my talk, which I'll go through a little quickly as well, is this notion. I was kind of inspired again by this idea of Mufassal, this idea of pictorialism that comes to play a very essential role, and how slowly it gets politicized in the context of India. And it's a 19th century trope that slowly enamels itself not only in publications but exhibitionary practices as well. And this sort of is a little bit about my forthcoming essay, which is on exhibitionary practices of photography from the 19th century till the present. What I was interested in, what triggered this, was again some dissertation works from the National Institute of Design. This is also an exhibition view from the show in Goa, Ephemeral. And the 2 flanking works are the ones I want to pay attention to right now. One is the work of Adi Perumal, this individual, who is a photographer for Chobi Mela, who's a poet. This is an unseen archive for the most part. And Perumal sort of goes about documenting Chobi Mela's life to the very, very end. And his photographs from the 40s and 50s bring about a rare intensity where this poet performs the persona of a writer, he performs the persona of a thinker. And these close-up renditions of Perumal that are mastered in time accentuated the kind of playfulness and performativeness in photography. The other one, which I find fascinating, which is this one, is the work of another photographer who's working as a photojournalist, and who comes about, Dani Bora is the name, comes about a poem by William Wordsworth called Lucy Gray. Oft I heard of Lucy Gray, and when I crossed the wild, I chanced to see her at the break of day. She was a solitary child, and then in an open field they crossed. The marks were still the same, they tracked them on, they were never lost, and to a bridge they came. And believe it or not, Dani Bora, who's producing this work in Assam in the 1930s and 40s, actually illustrates the poem of William Wordsworth through a photo book that is produced. So in a way, for me, these are kind of hidden, elided histories that need sort of presence right now. And I really lay claim to the idea of the university and what presences it can give us right now, through works such as Chobi Mela, through works such as Dani Bora. We then kind of move along to sort of other references that become significant in the history of pictorialism's presence. B. Chandra Manakya, the Maharaja of Tripura, founded the Camera Club in Agartala and eventually held annual exhibitions. As I said, the exhibition format becomes very important for me to consider over here. And you have a kind of view of him in his studio in the 1920s as well. And he gets documented immensely by another photographer by the name of Dave Berman, whose photograph this is. And I find it interesting, this art historical referencing he does with portraiture, because you have on the left-hand side a famous painting by Leon Bonnat of Job that is being copied by this particular king. And this sort of referencing of painting and photography, gets to a certain crescendo with the passage of time. It also happens with the works of Narayan Daji, who gets to exhibit his work at the Bombay Photographic Society exhibitions. As I mentioned, it happens with Ram Singh II, who becomes part of the Photographic Society of Bengal in 1856 and shows in this landmark exhibition post-mutiny in 1857 as well. But all of this lays claim quite distinctly to where photographs are shown, and to an extent you find them entering interior spaces as well. The wall on the right-hand side has a photograph image of it that is framed over there, and this is the work of a pioneering other photographer, Deen Dayal. But possibly the first photographic exhibition that ever takes place on a large scale is this one, the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition that brings together heavy works of pictorialism, and for the first time you have an exhibitionary practice emerging of photos. And so maybe that exhibition history practice can be sort of lay claim to what we're seeing right now. Other commissioned exhibitions were installed by patrons as well as the colonial administration during investitures, state visits of dignitaries, or spectacular imperial commemorations. They primarily showcased the development of traditional crafts and arts and the decorative arts. And photography was only gradually included in these displays, but perhaps not as a narrative and an aesthetic modality in its own right, but a utilitarian technology for the depiction of certain subject matter, and epigraphy was very, very important in this case. Meanwhile, the art establishment and the academy in Europe were also playing another kind of a role. In Paris, for instance, at the Grand Palais that you are looking at right now, photos of India were exhibited, or rather the subcontinent were exhibited for the first time in 1866 and 1867. And they kind of replicated classical exhibitions that you would see at the Louvre, for instance. So as photography was featured in industrial arts exhibitions, and while art institutions and museums were involved in arguments about aesthetics, more radical artists started coming to the fore in Europe and started showing works in their studios and in their homes. And Nadar is a great example to take for this, because very, very soon what we saw of the Maharaja of Tripura really starts as a fashion, as it were, after Nadar, who starts showing things in his own salon, as it were. And this sort of also is taken to another kind of crescendo when we look at another beautiful pictorial artist in India, Shapul Bhedwar. And he documents women in this way, but then you can imagine that the studio pretty much looks like a home space. And he documents also these sort of narrative series, and this one is called Tyag, the Renunciation series, where women are sort of taken from their homes and they follow a blind seer into the world and sort of get over material, as it were, material concerns with the passage of time. It also leads to other artists such as Randolph Pleasant Holmes and his work in Afghanistan, and this sort of lyrical way in which the Afghan warrior overlooks, from a hilltop down at the valley, is fascinating, I suppose, to some extent. But also, this is generated through an interaction of painting and photography. The virtuosity of such photographers and artists, local artists from Kolhapur, for instance, Baburao Painter, whose works we're looking at over here, who unexpectedly straddle the genres of art and photography, is apparent through painted canvases. Some practitioners often entered competitions managed by photo societies in other countries, and there were other curious events. For instance, the 1885 special exhibitions for photography and its applications in the arts created a huge sort of impact in India and South Asia more generally. The selection committee included individuals like Lord Frederick Leighton, who was a close associate of the pre-Raphaelite movement, Brotherhood, and became president of the Royal Academy of the Arts in London. But of course, this was all about producing exhibitions from the colony, from India and other colonies around the world. The influential and popular genre of pictorialism very much comes with this book, and it enters India, we trace, at the late 19th century. One of the other documents that we have in our archive is this one, Lord Tennyson and his friends. I think it's quite fascinating because the photographs over here are taken by another Indian-born photographer whose name is Julia Margaret Cameron, one of the first women photographers to practice in the region, as it were. And over here she's documented all her friends, Charles Darwin on the right-hand side, Tennyson on the left. She herself is in the middle. She's fascinating because she's also the great-grandaunt of Virginia Woolf. And so she brings together this beautiful interaction of literature, of painting, of photography to a great extent. This is some of her work from Sri Lanka from the late 19th century. She eventually goes back to Britain. But she also interacts with the Thackeray's, who are writers and painters. The Thackeray's in turn are associated with a picturesque painter by the name of Edward Lear. So what I was trying to do is sort of bring about this mandate for someone like Julia Margaret Cameron, who's always coming to India, who's come to India, who's come to Calcutta, who's sort of gone to Sri Lanka, but has got this aesthetic imprinted at the back of her mind. And where is this aesthetic coming from? What is her practice about to be? And I think, like many other photographers, her work really begins with the museum. She is sort of commissioned by the South Kensington Museum to take portraits based on the Elgin marbles, and for those of you who know the Elgin marbles, they are sort of the epitome of, as it were, Greek art that are represented over there, but she sort of animates them in photographs. So for the first time, what the museum is interested in photography is how to animate sculpture, is how to sort of create an adjunct to material that already exists as an antiquity and as a repository. And so its place today in the museum is curious because it still kind of follows this traditional node. It always seems as though in a museum it plays a kind of subsidiary role to the other artifacts that are in there. And we've kind of struggled with this in India, how to create this bridge. But of course, they are also used as teaching tools, and that's very, very important. A crucial institutional adjunct to the museumizing of the photograph in India, therefore, as I mentioned to you, was this great exhibition, the 1851-52 exhibition of South Kensington. Right from the start, photography was central to the museum's educational mission, and the administration was part of this national debate on how museums in the subcontinent were to have a defined pedagogic role, both in terms of constructing and exhibiting specific representations of the natives, and of course, training the eye. It was always meant to be a lesson in taste, and all of these sort of dramatic sort of clauses that were given to what photographs should do. Two other individuals who are fascinating at this time are, of course, Rudyard Kipling and his father, John Lockwood Kipling, who establishes a school, of course, in Lahore, and also is responsible to become the curator of various investitures that take place in India at the time. And so what is being shown in these exhibitions are landscapes, what is being shown in these exhibitions are portraits. They're kind of appropriated, they're kind of based on pictorialism, they are also kind of tableau images, and they bring to light this sort of interesting interaction between Glasgow and Paris and Melbourne in India at a very, very early time in the history of photography. But there are other sort of interventions that are made at a pedagogic level, and I was interested in showing this. One was, of course, how India is represented outside. So believe it or not, 1920s Wembley, this is what they construct in order to house an exhibition of antiquities and photographs. It's an entire landscape that is virtually transformed into a kind of mini India. And of course, we have postcards of these in the archive, but very often they have not been looked for what modes of exhibitionary practice were deployed. And this is because, I mean, it does seem surprising to us that you have these kinds of displays, but there's already a strong impulse of the school, of the art school from Europe and India right now, through images like these. The Maharana of Udaipur sends his artists to the Slade School of Art in London in the 1890s, and thereby brings about a kind of revolution in thinking about the portrait, and of course embellishing the portrait with these hyperreal, hybridized images. And so constantly maneuvering standards of viewing, mystery, dematerialization, and diffusion, these become kind of important tools by which photography is finding its history in India to a great extent. The influential model was also implemented in art schools in Madras in 1850, Calcutta 1854, Bombay 1856, Lahore 1878, whose primary mandate was to reinforce, again, traditional crafts and where India plays a role in it. And so the photograph was always seen as something decorative, something that was illustrative. The art schools, therefore, maybe would have arrived at curricula for photography, and this is also something that we're studying. The Elphinstone College of Art and the J.J. School of Art in India from the 19th century onwards started teaching photography. What were their curriculas about is something that we're investigating right now. Was there an overt referencing of photography and performance, for instance? These are works of the Marathi Natya Sangeet from the 1920s, also shot in Bombay, where you have kind of a social impulse coming out through photography, where it's fascinatingly enough, men were the only ones allowed to perform on the stage, as it were, at this time. So the two individuals that you see in the center frame are actually men enacting the roles of women. I find this very, very curious, and slowly we are, of course, moving and pressing against the moment of nationalism. At the turn of the century, the nationalistic fervor had taken root amongst various intellectuals, critics, reformers, Rabindranath Tagore, Swami Vivekanand, Anand Kumar Swami. Kumar Swami is again an important individual to consider because he starts collecting photography from South Asia for the Boston Museum of Art in the early 20th century. And Aurobindo Ghosh as well, who promoted industrial, mechanized, mass-produced Swadeshi objects to endorse a national ideology. They aspired to combat the overarching influence of a European aesthetic by promoting what was local. The exhibition organized in Ahmedabad, and I find this an important exhibition, of the Indian National Congress in 1902, foregrounds the works of local artisans for the revitalization and the preservation of the dying arts, they call it. And of course, photography has a small inclusion over here. The early 20th century seemed to be awaiting successful practitioners to take root, and I think there were other colonial exhibitions such as this one in Kutsiabad, where a huge arts exhibition was installed of industrial arts again. But what was actually in them? And I find these local principal states to be fascinating because they also project this trajectory of the coming together of European and, as it were, Asian art at a curious point of time. So the 1920s and 30s, as I mentioned to you, has Joseph Wershing, but it also has other individuals such as the Maharaja of Indore, who actually brings Brancusi over in order to produce a series of works in his court. But at the same time brings over a German architect by the name of Eckhard Muthesius to produce Art Nouveau architecture for him. And Eckhard Muthesius also produces these photographs that remain. So the modern history of photography sort of starts edging towards post-independence. And what happens in post-independence is a kind of humanism that enters after World War II. This mirrored the trajectory of fine art at the time, with artists making abstract and figurative works that broke traditional norms. But slowly, we gradually come about curious exhibitions such as the Family of Man being installed in India at the time and several states within India, which comes from the Museum of Modern Art in 1955-56. And we have a lovely view of it. The reason I'm showing you this is because these exhibitions suddenly bring together the sort of creative energies of Gropius and Herbert Bayer, who wanted to demonstrate the interpretive possibilities engaged by images in a contained space. How do you do this within the white cube? The exhibition was divided into sections. We know the Family of Man based on birth and death. These are some images we have of them, and this is an image we have of it installed in Bombay in 1956. Very soon after this, another sort of intervention is made in photography and an exhibitionary practice by Bresson. But before Bresson, we have another sort of important move towards nationalism and pictorialism and photography through the works of the pioneering artist Vittalbhai Jhaveri, who produces apparently the longest film that exists on Gandhi. It's over 300 minutes. He won several national awards for it, but at the same time, he was using the pictorial trope in order to deal with certain politics of the time. So suddenly we find from the 19th century, where this interface with art is important, art as subversion becomes an important document with the works of Vittalbhai Jhaveri and the transformation to independence. But this is what Bresson's legacy is, for instance. I find he establishes a school at the Aurobindo Ashram, a very, very important school, that kind of lives on till today. You have individuals such as Robi Ganguly, you have a photographic society that is established over there, and it's endorsed by the Photographic Society of the International Federation of Photographic Art from the United States as well. And they develop their own sort of, let's say, their own festival that runs all the way to the mid-1980s, when it sort of stops because of a sort of issue with the postal service. It becomes very difficult for us to import works from the outside because of the tariffs that are suddenly levied. But until from the mid-1950s to the 80s, possibly the first large photo festival that was existing in South Asia perhaps started in Pondicherry. I'm not sure about it, but I haven't found any other references. It might be interesting to look at what their exhibitionary practices were as well. And so today, and I'll end with this, I'm consciously trying to theorize the possibility of the festival, the museum, and the gallery, and their current pedagogic function in accommodating other classes of material objects, and thus inscribing many more narrative trajectories within the logic of aesthetic pluralism. But there still seem to be very little debate about how photographs themselves constructed meaning within these systems of representation. Is this because the national ethos of a museum culture in South Asia has very rarely looked at archiving, has very rarely looked at preserving? Is this apparent lack of an institutional interest? I've certainly found this within our national institutions in India. This lack of an interest thoroughly encoded is something being hidden. And in terms of the current populist reconfigurations of collective consciousnesses erupting across the globe about our allegiances, about our affiliations, and our entitlements as nationals, perhaps the urgent question can come from this particular referencing of an author who's written about the emotional afterlife of images. If citizenship is posed around questions of political subjectivities, how do collections participate in the governance of different citizens or differentiated citizens, especially with regard to questions of belonging? And so what I've tried to show over the last 100 years approximately, and very quickly, how institutionally and privately supported creative projects in photography and photo art have deepened and widened the viewer experience within exhibitionary practices and raised a different set of expectations. As cultural institutions are transforming from classical repositories to more dynamic sites of visual assertion, ideology, metaphor, memory, entertainment, and social history, and as the contemporary sphere of photography continues to evolve with a heavy strain of the documentary, we should continue to ask what really constitutes the pre-modern, what constitutes the contemporary. What is the essence of this contractual union, the coming together of what appears to be coercively and harmoniously embodying each other's dreams, yet also remaining unknown and unknowable to one another? With the three traditional coordinates that I've tried to bring about, museum, archive, contemporary, and exhibition, by which photographic territory can be mapped and analyzed, continue to evolve past our conventional roles as historical genres and meld their trajectories into the furtherance of a more inclusive subcontinental image discourse. And I just want to end with this short film that I had found from the Films Division in India, which I had also shown in as part of ephemeral new futures for passing images. Because we talk of interdisciplinarity, and yesterday again I was very intrigued by Naeem's talk, because for one I mentioned the non-aligned movement triggered a lot of cultural activity, at least in India as far as I know. You also have the Films Division, surprisingly, in India, that is endorsing the works of artists, photographers, and filmmakers to come together and create interdisciplinarity in their visual culture and their visual art. So believe it or not, this is from 1973, the year before the NAM meeting with Bangladesh. And I find it bringing together some curious trajectories into one focus. I hope the volume is on.
Thank you, Rob. It was great to finish with this animation. Quite interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Rahab, you shown this part of the archive that is images from the Congress that you said that you had tried to show in places in India, and it had got some resistance. So would you like to tell a bit more about that? What kind of spaces and in which time? I mean, have you ever been able to show that work? And is it different now, or has it always been the same?
Well, you would ask that question, Tanvi. No, so there was, over the last 2 years, we've been consistently trying to, and the early part of the talk was trying to figure out what this iconography of resistances through images is, and you know very well yourself because we brought the citizen issue out together. I was trying to create historical references of what resistance can mean, and to an extent see whether national institutions would endorse this, or whether there were subversive ways of actually inserting it. There are subversive ways of inserting it. You just can't have National Congress written on top while the opposition is in power, I realized. And there was a resistance to this by way of saying from national institutions that the time was sort of not appropriate, but that they were kind of interested because the Congress also played this role of a national mobilizer for everyone at one point of time. However, the particularities of our government, as you know this, and unfortunately cultural institutions that become pawns of that particular power with the passage of time, and I've sort of had to encounter this more recently, as you know as well, is that there's always a certain symbolism attached to images. And I think this is where they find it most dangerous, how that can easily be construed as opposition or endorsement. And I think this idea of polarity, which in one sense is the infusion of bureaucracy within cultural institutions, is what needs to be countered to an extent. And of course, where photography is doing this is important to question, because after a while, we don't even know what the history of the representation of photography is in India post-independence. What kind of a narrative slant has it taken? What kind of an ideological turn has it taken? Has there been one? And of course, the most important question is whether young people, young individuals have actually been brought into the fray within the national ethos of exhibition making. And I don't think they have. I mean, there are very few examples which we can cite where a generation like this one, very much in this room also, gets to show at a national institution and talk about process and talk about experimentation. And then, of course, associate with a political discourse, maybe. I mean, one of the greatest challenges, and we were talking about this as well, is that artists and photographers, naturally, because of the documentary mode, because of the veracity of the image, have to also contend with politics more intensely. But does politics actually cohere or listen to the work of artists is a question. Artists are working in that direction, but what is the sort of absorption? Is a question we ask, I mean, even with artists who have united right now at the Red Fort, right? So you have to keep working, I think, and creating a mandate for the inclusion of this. And hopefully you will find at one point of time or the other an individual sitting at a cultural institution who is able to convince the ministries about this. The other sort of problem with it is that, as you know, a lot of the ministries of culture in India, at least to a certain point of time, were also absorbed within the Home Ministry and the Ministry of Poverty Alleviation and Urban Housing. So culture kind of came under that rubric. How are we going to push back against all of that? The first fund to go after every campaign is the culture fund, right? It's the one from which you take and give it to urban housing, and so many of the concerns that are perhaps very significant and pivotal right now. So maybe culture has to manage to, and it always does, absorb itself into that institution covertly, but also consistently. So maybe, I think after receiving proposal after proposal after proposal, there is a sort of insertion. And so one shouldn't give, one shouldn't give up, and one should persevere to an extent. But it's a slow process. And right now, it's been more difficult than it has at many points of time. So the other refrain is that so much of the time, even with the show that I was involved with the Science Museum right in London, and people were very curious about what was the engagement of photography from the subcontinent over there. Of course, we were trying to manifest different directions. The point being is that sometimes you have to find yet again endorsement from foreign institutions in the West in order to create a mandate for their inclusion in India. This sort of inversion of a process is something that has played out consistently over the years. And actually the last slide, which I did not show, maybe I did show it, brings this to a whole. I know absolutely nothing about this exhibition, for instance, or very little about this exhibition that was at the Photographers Gallery in 1982. It was a photography show devoted to Indian photography. I actually have only found one visual of it, which is off the refrigerator of like Sunil Gupta, who has a photo. It's the Polaroid shot that he just shot at the time. The catalogue has kind of disappeared. He luckily shared this material with me. But such little is known. This is also the time of the Festival of India in Oxford, which was curated by David Elliott and various other curators. But this was something that was done in the Photographers Gallery then. Also, the reason for me showing you Pramod Bhatti's film from 1973 is that's almost half a century ago. So I'm really curious as to what our sort of impulse or push towards transnationalism is going to be now. And do I need a Congress Party album as one refractor of it? Or are there various other ways in which we can create an interesting dialogue around that context? So the ambience, the environment, and then the propositions that might come from that. So yeah, to answer you very, very quickly, the directors are constantly changing, but the direction is not. And maybe that is something important to consider at the level of policy. So how do we actually make photography an important policy engagement within a national institution because of its absorption of so many languages? As the most ubiquitous language in the world, maybe it's time now for that national institution to take cognizance and create a space for it. That would be nice.